Today is the last Sunday that we're working with Esther and the story that comes out of that book. It's an interesting book. It starts and it finishes with food and festivities. King Ahasuerus or something, otherwise known as King Xerxes, which is a lot easier to say. And interestingly, those both come from the same name through different roots and different languages. As much as one starts with an A and one starts with an X, they're both have their roots in the same spot. He was king over all of Persia at one point. And as it says in the Bible, from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. The book opens with a banquet. Well, King Xerxes had gathered all of his leaders across his empire to try and do some planning. The best guess of historians is that they were planning the invasion of Greece, which in the end didn't turn out too well. But they took 6 months to do this planning, all of the leaders that he gathered together. And during the 6 months, he spent a whole bunch of time showing everybody how great he was and how powerful he was and all of the great wealth of the kingdom and having all sorts of ceremonies and all sorts of fancy events. And he concluded with 7 days of feasting. We're told at the end of the 7 days, when the king was merry with wine, he was with all of his advisors, who would all have been men, who presumably also were all merry with wine. And he ordered Vashti, his wife, to come before them because he wanted to show off her great beauty. You can imagine what this might have looked like. Vashti was not impressed. She did not think that this was something that she should be doing, and she refused, which created a domestic issue between the king and queen, but it very quickly escalated into a national issue because the king's advisors told him, if the queen can say no to you, the king, what about all the wives in all of the households in the kingdom saying no to their husbands? And it's just going to be a disaster. There's going to be confusion and rebellion and contempt and wrath everywhere. So Vashti was sent away. That created a problem because a king needs a queen. And so there was a process of how they were going to search for a new queen. They were going to find all of the eligible virgins in the whole country and gather them together and prepare them so that the king could choose a new queen. And he did, and he chose Esther. Esther, who was Jewish, but she had been warned by her cousin Mordecai, who had looked after her from an infant because she was, or from a young age since she was an orphan. He had warned her not to say anything about her roots, her Jewishness. Now, we've been introduced to some of these characters over the last number of weeks. Mordecai was apparently a guard at the temple, at the palace, and he at one point overheard a threat on the king's life, and he reported it to the king, so the king was able to do away with the people who were threatening him. There was another character who we've also been introduced to in the last number of weeks called Haman. Haman was the king's lead advisor. He was the prime minister. And he really didn't like Jews. And on top of that, he really, really didn't like Mordecai. Now, it's possible that there were some historic clashes between Haman's people and the Jewish people. Doesn't say. But in the process of what he was doing and working out of this hate for the Jewish people, he got the king to sign an edict to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews in all the territories that the king was in charge of. The young and the old and all the ones in the middle. And it was all to happen on one day, the 13th day of Adar. And just to make sure that this really happened, Haman made sure that there was a nice clause at the bottom that said, if you do this, you get to keep all the plunder, all the wealth of the people you've killed. So this created a problem for Mordecai and Esther because they were both Jews. And Esther was in a very tough situation because as queen, she was perhaps able to influence the king, but it didn't sound like queens had a great deal of influence. And if you went and approached the king uninvited, you got killed. So there was a bit of an issue there that she was faced with. Mordecai reminded her that being the queen wasn't going to save her from this edict. And then he said, maybe you came to royal honor for just such a time as this. And then Esther said to Mordecai, get together all of our people and fast for me, and I will do the same with the people around me. And after she had done that, she invited the king and Haman to a feast. And when the king and Haman came to the dinner, the king said to her, so what is it that you want? I will give you anything. Up to half of my kingdom I will give you. What is it that you want? And she said, what I want is for you and Mordecai for you and Haman to come back again tomorrow night. Between the banquets, there was some significant action. So first of all, Haman, on his way home from the banquet, passed by the place where Mordecai was. And Mordecai wasn't afraid of Haman. And he didn't bow down to him. And this infuriated Haman. So when Haman finally got home, he started bragging to his family and to his friends who were there about his great successes and how he'd advanced up the power system so that he was now second in command of all of the kingdom. And he bragged about his sons and what they were doing. And he bragged that he had just had supper with the king and the queen. And that tomorrow night he was going to have supper with the king and queen as well. And then he started complaining about Mordecai and how infuriating he was. And his wife came up with a suggestion. She said, why don't you build a gallows and go to the king and ask the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows, and then you can go to dinner tomorrow night and be perfectly happy. So he built the gallows. That night, the king was trying to get to sleep and was having problems. So he asked the court recorder to come in and to read some of the things that had happened in the court in recent days. And one of the things that was read to him was about how Mordecai had warned him about the assassination attempt. And then the king started wondering, what could he do to honor someone who had saved his life? So he asked which of his advisors were in the palace, and he was told that Haman had just entered. Now Haman had gone into the palace to go to the king to ask him to hang Mordecai. But the king asked Haman to come in, and he asked, what should I do for a person that I wish to honor? And Haman, who thought this was all about himself, came up with a great plan. He said, well, create a parade and take him through the streets and put him on one of your royal horses and dress him in royal clothes and have someone shouting out in front of him, this is a really great guy who does great things for the king. Yeah, and I just quoted from VeggieTales. Anyway. I've been watching the VeggieTales version of Esther a little bit too often recently. So the king said, this is a great idea. Do it for me. Do it for Mordecai. So Haman, not thrilled about this, dressed Mordecai appropriately, put him on the horse, took him through the streets, and after this was all done, he went home. And he told his family what had happened, and he was most unimpressed. At that point, his wife said, as part of the story was that Mordecai was named as a Jew, so Haman had told his family that Mordecai was a Jew, and his wife said, if Mordecai really is a Jew, you're not going to prevail over him. And while they were still talking, his ride to go back to the palace for the second banquet arrived, and so he left. And so while they were eating, the king and Haman and Esther, the king asked Esther again, "What is it that you want?" "You can have anything you want, up to half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "All I want is my life and the life of my people, because we've been sold to be destroyed." And the king said, "Who is doing this? Who could possibly do this?" And Esther pointed to Haman and said, "He is the enemy." Well, the king was furious, and as he was trying to figure out what to do next, he was told about the gallows that Haman had just had built, so he decided that he would put the gallows to use and had Haman hanged, and decided to hang his sons with him. But there was still a problem, because a king couldn't revoke a decree that he'd already made. And so there was still this decree out there encouraging people to try and kill the Jews. And so the king came up with a new edict saying that the Jews could defend themselves. And he sent this out to all 127 provinces, each province and to each people. The edict was written in their own language, so everybody had it clear that this is what was going to happen, that the Jews could defend themselves. And so in this way, the enemies of the Jews were destroyed. And to remember these events, the Jews were told to have a feast. And Janice and Macon are going to read from Esther chapter 9, verses 18, and tell us a bit more about this.
But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness.
Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the open towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, a holiday on which they send gifts of food to one another.
Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Xerxes, both near and far,
enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month year by year,
as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor.
So the Jews adopted as a custom what they had begun to do, as Mordecai had written to them.
This festival that was established something like 2,500 years ago still happens. It's called Purim. Let's do some more thinking on Esther. We spent some time over the last weeks reflecting on Esther and how the story, which is a very old story, can connect with us in some ways. And Doug spent some time with us talking about time and seasons and how things shift for us, picking up on the particular text of Esther being called for such a season as this. Tim last week talked to us about how listening to God's nudges can result in some very interesting connections. Esther is a story that does not have God breaking into the story as lots and lots of other stories from the Bible are like. But it's a story of people responding to situations that God has put them in. Esther became a queen. She didn't plan it. She didn't do it. It happened to her, but she became a queen, which is actually not very much like us, at least not like most of us in this room anyways. But we actually probably have more control and more choices in our lives than she did. In the course of becoming queen, she had to live through the situations that she was placed in. She had to respond to the situations that God had placed her in. This story is a very serious story. It's about the annihilation of a people. But it's written with a great deal of humor. There's repetition, there's contrasts, and there's lots of irony in the story. And there's feasts. Esther has 2 feasts with the king and Haman. But before she even got to those feasts, the king started with a feast. 7 days of feasting. That's what got him into trouble with Vashti. And then at the end of the story, we're told that the Jewish people, were told to have a feast every year to remember the events of the story. There's a comment that I have read that apparently Jewish people sometimes say of their feasts. The feasts can be somewhat summed up in this way. They tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. Now, that may not be totally accurate of all the feasts, but there is something to some of that. In that events of Esther and lots of other stories in the Old Testament, but in this particular case, in the story out of Esther, the Jewish people received salvation. And they marked it with a festival called Purim, that they're still marking today and remembering the events of Esther. Now, we're not Jewish. We don't celebrate Purim. We're Christians and we're living today, but maybe we should reflect a little bit on what it is that we have to celebrate, what it is that we have to say thank you for, and then to ponder how is it that we mark what it is that we're trying to be thankful for. We're not in the midst of being wiped out. We didn't just escape being annihilated as a people. So that's not part of our story. It's not part of what we need to be thankful for. Except it is interesting. The Jewish people in their history have had a numerous times where they've almost been wiped out, and then many times they've changed that into a time to remember and to celebrate the fact that they weren't wiped out, that they have been saved. Mennonites haven't done that. And yet our history has had some of the same sorts of almost being wiped out sort of experiences. We just don't seem to celebrate that in the same way. We have potlucks and stuff and other ways to have food together. But these Jewish feasts, these Jewish festivals, are really festivals of thanksgiving, recognizing that God has done something for them that they couldn't do themselves, and they're giving thanksgiving to God. It's why it's really appropriate for us to be ending at the end of the book of Esther today on Thanksgiving and finding ways for us to be thankful to God for God's presence in our lives. It's really easy at Thanksgiving for us to be thankful to God for all the things that God has put in our lives, mostly things that are in our lives because we happen to live here in Southern Ontario, where by and large things are pretty good. There are jobs, there's lots of jobs. Crops actually grow. We can predict that when we plant something, it's likely to produce. When we lived in Botswana, over half the years of independence have been drought years. The farmers weren't sure if they should bother planting, because if it was a drought year, nothing would come up. It wouldn't be just that it was a poor crop, there would be nothing. So, we live here in a land that really has a lot going for it. There are a lot of opportunities here. So, it becomes very easy for us to say thank you to God because we happen to live here. It's the luck of the draw that we happen to live here. But is that really all that we have to be thankful for? I mean, it is significant to be thankful for it. But I think we need to be careful how we offer those thanks. We need to be careful that we don't say something like this: boy, am I thankful that I've got it better than those guys. And I have heard over and over again people who come back from a service experience or come back from some sort of third world experience and they say, we are so lucky that we have it so good. Or I'm so thankful that, and it's like, that's just luck that we ended up here. So, yes, it's appropriate that we thank God for the green, for the incredible green around us. It really is impressive. I mean, starting in the spring when we have all different colors of green until now where some of that green has turned red and we've got this amazing set of colors around us. And for the crops and for the family and friends that God has placed in our lives. It's all very, very appropriate. But I think it's significant that when we do say thank you for those things, that we also take a step back. And that when we're talking to God and offering our thanks to God, that we're thanking God less by saying something like, phew, we're so lucky, right? To more, thank you, God, for, and then being able to identify something, ways in which God has touched us, ways in which God has led us, ways in which God has nurtured us into being the people that we are. The Esther story is a story without a mention of God in it. There are no flashes of light. There are no celestial voices. I've been working on Christmas stuff. There's no celestial voices in Esther. There's no miracles. There's no healings. There's no walking on the water. In fact, the description of the times of Esther sound a lot like our times because for most of us, for most of our lives, we aren't seeing those big flashy things. The story of Esther is in lots of ways the story of the everyday and how everyday sorts of stuff and God's stuff intersects. And it doesn't necessarily intersect with a huge big bang. It's a story that reminds us that God's words are not necessarily lofty and wonderful and amazing, but that God's words are made real and they're made personal in our lives and in the lives of the people around us. At the very end of the book of Matthew, Jesus says to his disciples, "Remember, I am with you always." He says it in the context to the disciples, go and act in my name, go and act in ways that are representative of the ways that I would act, and remember, I am with you always. Not only in the big things, not only in the scary things, not only in the frightening things, but in the everyday things that you're going to do over and over again, I am with you then too. So Esther, who did become a queen without planning, she ended up there with through a series of events and the gifts that God had given her to be able to get there. She was just living. And the events of her life put her in a very unexpected place. We too are just living and are exposed to all sorts of events in our lives as well. And those events put us in places, some of which are highly unexpected, and some of which probably actually we expect to get there. But it doesn't matter if they're unexpected or if we expect to get to those places. Remember that God tells us that it doesn't matter if it's an unexpected or an expected place, that God is with us always. And there's another thing that's underlined throughout the whole book of Esther. There are no situations in which God's voice cannot speak. And these are things to give thanks to God for. That God is with us. Good things can happen. Really, really great things can happen. Bad things can happen, difficult things can happen, all sorts of stuff can happen. But remember, God is with us. God is always with us. And for this we can give thanks. Let's pray. Lord, sometimes it's easy to see your presence with us, and sometimes it's much more difficult. The story of Esther, and the reality is the story of our own lives, reminds us that as we walk, as we journey, you are with us. Always. Help us when things get very difficult to be able to stop and to look at you and to recognize your presence with us. And help us when things are going wonderfully well to be able to give you thanks as well. Thank you that no matter where we go, no matter what the situation is, no matter if it's a place we expect to be or a place we don't expect to be, that you are with us. Thank you. Amen.